walks onto stage. Good whatever, lady and gentlemen. Monty Python are an extraordinary circus of talent. Although Monty Python's talent is best displayed in film format. Monty Python's films ended as a trilogy, with the Holy Grail being the first, and the meaning of life the last. The Holy Grail introduced Monty Python's unusual humor to a wider audience, with a series of comedy sketches tied together in some kind of comedic fable. It is hard to understand these days exactly how subversive Monty Python were, given today's society. Pauses. But it was, and the release of a movie that used the story of the birth of Christ as a backdrop pissed off a lot of people, which is probably what it was intended to do. Smirks. With great comedy comes great irresponsibility. Pauses. I avoid references to religions in my comedy, because it is easy to ridicule. Perhaps this is on purpose. A test of faith, for which I doff my cap to whatever deity you pay homage to. Pauses. However, pissing people off is what I am here to do, so I shall continue. Pauses. Almost forgot. Spoilers. Smirks. I am not going to sequentially walk through the movie. Instead, I will highlight the sketches that I found amusing, in some kind of order. The life of Brian starts with a reference to the birth of Christ, with the three wise men not being wise enough to notice Brian was not the child they were looking for. There's some blackface here, but, given the way Monty Python improvises everything, from female leads to horses, I doubt any racial slur was involved. The Life of Brian was released in 1979. Lenny Henry was appearing in the black and white minstrels, and comedians regularly used stereotypes to comedic effect. These days, you can only mock homogeneity. I said homogeneity. Smirks. After giving the three gifts to Mandy, Brian's mother, and their praise to the baby Brian, the wise men realize their mistake, and unceremoniously take the gifts back, whilst assaulting poor Mandy. Then promptly gather around the real baby Jesus' crib, with Mary and Joseph, who are shown with halos. This is an amusing sketch, as it points out. How did the three wise men know which baby was Jesus? A comedic theme presented throughout the movie. Looks left. It is hard to understand why offense might be taken. These types of questions would be asked by children. Perhaps the response people are given is at fault, more than the nativity. Looks right. Clearly the three wise men had written a spiritual app to locate the baby Jesus. Pauses. So the scene is set with everybody behaving quite English, and Mandy, Brian's mother, being played by a man. Rolls eyes. The movie fast forwards in time to Jesus, the man, the Messiah, which is a joke in itself, most people miss. Pauses. The ungrateful leper sketch is quite amusing, with Michael Palin hopping around asking for alms for an ex-leper. Bloody do-gooders. As is the stoning sketch. Here we are introduced to the bearded women, with the stoning stones salesman selling beards for women and quality stones. You need to understand the historical context to maximize the amusement of this sketch. The beards are because women were largely excluded from society, with the seller referencing capitalism, the disconnection of society with resources. There are plenty of stones and pebbles to hand, although buying them from a seller is more convenient and attractive. The old man is being stoned for blasphemy. His crime, using a word out of context. Does this remind you of anything? Smirks. These days, it is more the case that some authority takes words out of context, then prosecutes using some obscure law, rather than blasphemy. But the societal behavior appears the same. Right on. The women with beards joke is played heavily here, with biological women wearing beards, so they are allowed to throw stones at the blasphemer. A bit like Twitter. John Cleese plays the high priest conducting the stoning, using his Basil character. Fawlty Towers was still running at the time. Pauses. It is amusing in itself to see various characters played by the same actor. This is done throughout the movie, with Graham Chapman having the least number of roles. Brian, and biggest dickus. Smirks. Terry Jones plays Mandy Cohen, Brian's mother. Perhaps this is where Goldie-looking Chain got their inspiration for, your mother's got a penis. There's nothing funny in that. But I digress. Smirks. It is the revelation that Brian is half Roman that leads Brian to become a rebel, a fake messiah, and ultimately leads him to his death. Reg and the boys behave more like a 70s trades union than a rebel force, with meeting minutes, formal vernacular, and votes on resolutions. Brian's first task of the rebellion is to write "Romans go home" on the Roman temple. However, Brian is caught misspelling the Latin text by a Roman praetorian, played by John Cleese, and forced to write out "Romans go home" 100 times, like a naughty schoolboy. Once completed, his guards go. But then Brian is met by their replacements, and they are not pleased. Brian's second task is to kidnap Pilate's wife and ask for the Romans to leave. This scene has a number of amusing features, including the fig leaf, and ends with the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea killing each other, with Brian being dragged off to the dungeons. The texture of the sketches varies a lot, with some scenes descending into comic book comedy, with the Roman search of the Judean People's Front headquarters going from the sublime to the ridiculous. What with 50 Roman centurions running into the small room, the Judean People's Front, very obvious hiding places, and the wooden spoon. The scene ends with Matthias, the headquarters owner, saying to the Roman commander, "Crucifixion's a doddle, and you haven't given us time to hide." Pauses. Brian ends up falling onto a speaker's plinth, where he has to pretend to be one of the many messiahs, imparting spiritual guidance onto the gathered masses, which consist of 5 people who end up heckling him into explaining his guidance. Brian engages with them until the Roman centurions are all gone, then runs away, only to be followed by the multitude. More on that later. The haggling sketch is amusingly irritating. Brian pays the sellers straight off the asking price for the faux beard, but the seller is having none of it. He wants to haggle, and so the sketch begins. It's classic radio entertainment, on par with Who is on First, without the intellectual tongue twisting. Pauses. You lucky bastard. The dungeon scene is classic Monty Python, with Brian conversing with his cellmate, as he envies Brian for the jailer's favoritism. "They must think you're Lord God Almighty. What will they do to me?" Brian asks. "Oh, you'll probably get away with crucifixion." Crucifixion? Yeah, first offense. Best thing the Romans ever did for us. If we didn't have crucifixion, this country would be in a right bloody mess. Smirks. There is a brief surreal interlude at one point in the movie, when Brian tries to escape from the Roman centurions. He ends up running up an unfinished winding staircase and falling down once he reaches the top, only to be caught by a passing spaceship. The aliens fly off into space, where there is a space battle, only for the spaceship to crash back down to Earth, at the base of the tower that Brian had fell from moments earlier, with a passerby remarking, "Ooh, you lucky bastard," as Brian steps from the wreckage, unscathed. Rolls eyes. Brian does eventually get the girl. Judith and Brian appear in glorious 70s nakedness, which I think was part of the Monty Python look and feel, since nudity was frowned upon, and Mary Whitehouse had the BBC where she wanted it. Pauses. "Hail Messiah!" screams the multitude in chorus. "I'm not the Messiah," Brian insists. "Will you please listen? I am not the Messiah, do you understand?" Honestly. The crowd pauses, then responds in chorus. "Only the true Messiah denies his divinity." Brian exclaims. "What? Well, what sort of chance does that give me? All right. I am the Messiah." The crowd cheer. He is the Messiah." Pauses. Brian shouts, "Now. Fuck off." Pauses. Brian's mum plays the crowd for a while, too. "Now, you listen here. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. Now, go away." Pauses. But the crowd remains, nonetheless. Apparently, many of the extras in the crowd could not speak English, and mimicked their lines as sounds, not knowing the meaning of the words they said. Smirks. Monty Python played a lot on the commentary of people of the time, trying to put meaning into things that had no meaning. Looks left. Or do they? Looks right. As Brian said. "Look, you've got it all wrong. You don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody. You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals. Pauses. Spike Milligan has a cameo where he looks bewildered and lost. Mainly because he was. Smirks. And on to Biggest Dickus. The best scene in the movie, where the Roman centurions are ordered not to laugh, which only makes them smirk more. The puerile nature of the comedy makes it timeless. If you find that kind of humor amusing, with Pilate not understanding the humor, because his friend is called Biggest Dickus, whilst the centurions realize the name of Brian's Roman father is made up. The punishment for laughing at Biggest Dickus is certain death at the Colosseum, which only makes the name Biggest Dickus even funnier. Pauses. The lying for crucifixion scene is played as if the prisoners have a choice, with Mr. Cheeky having a laugh at his predicament. Pauses. Crucifixion. Ah, no. Freedom. Freedom for me. They said I hadn't done anything, so I could go free and live on an island somewhere. The Roman pauses, then replies. Oh. Oh, well, that's jolly good. Well, off you go, then. Smirks. And he does, after being freed from crucifixion after jokingly saying that he was Brian of Nazareth. Rolls eyes. The two jailers both have verbal impediments when the Romans are talking to them, yet communicate normally when alone, which is a reference to the English class system, with Cockney rhyming slang being a formal example of this. Pauses. At the Passover festival, a prisoner is to be freed, and Pilate, with his speech impediment, asks the crowd, who should he free? The crowd, as the centurion warned, were in a funny mood, and ask for people whose names begin with R, laughing out loud when Pilate echoes the name. More puerile humor, likely to get you banned on social media these days. After Biggest Dickus has a go who has a lisp, and the crowd is exhausted with their laughing, Judith shouts out Brian's name, and the guards are sent to the hill to rescue Brian. Meanwhile, Brian has already been taken to the hill, and is already on his cross. Pauses. A lot of the humor seen in the life of Brian is seen The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, even though the authors and topics are vastly different. Is Arthur Dent Brian Cohen in space? Is Trillian Judith in space? Who knows? Who cares? The timeless wonder of the space-time continuum is for the beholder to wear. Pauses. Some of the humor in the life Brian is a little dated, with the references to the Jewish section in the crucifixion being one item, and the bickering at Jesus' sermon another. There is comedy in both, just that it is of its time. Rolls eyes. The fully trained suicide squadron is amusing, although pretending to kill themselves distracts from the comedy. At the time, the swastika was still used generally in comedy, so the symbology was open to ridicule. The Star of David merged with the swastika is probably more offensive than comedic these days. You will find ridiculous characters like the Suicide Squadron within many comedy shows, with the blind SAS Commandos in the comic strip Presents being a suitable, memorable mention. Smirks. The movie is topped and tailed with a song. The film titles start with Brian, the song, a James Bond-style comedic symphony, outlining the life of Brian, and ends with Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, a concert hall-style sing-along. The crucifixions are carried out in a matter-of-fact manner, with the crucified chatting normally. Brian resigns himself to his fate as each of his hopes are dashed on the rocks of reality. Pauses. You come from nothing. You're going back to nothing. What have you lost? Nothing. Smirks. Peace, I am out of here, word up. Exits stage left.